The PITT, led by Ishmael Asher, a former Brotherhood initiate, father of the cure for the PITT sickness. The PITT Raiders are some of the toughest and well-organized raider groups that the player can find in the capital wasteland. Living in the bombed-out ruins of what was once formerly known as Pittsburgh, these raiders have a far-reaching grasp on the wasteland, from DC all the way to the ruins of Ronto. So that begs the question, what happened to the PITT Raiders after the events of Fallout 3? For this theory, we're going to assume that the Vault Dweller doesn't free the PITT and instead stops the uprising and allows Asher to remain in control, though I will dive deeper into the other alternative later in the video. The main question is, could the PITT prosper and become a wasteland powerhouse like so many others before them? Or would Maxon put a stop to the PITT once he came into power? Welcome, Wastelander, to Think Tank. So before we can figure this out, we need to understand a few things about the PITT. We need to understand its hierarchy, the raiders that live there, the extent of the raiders' reach, and Ishmael Asher and what he wants. The history of the PITT is long and filled with danger around every turn, from pre-war pollution to the city being targeted heavily during the war for its industrial prowess. The PITT lives up to its name. It doesn't even stop there. In the last 200 years, the city has been divided, broken down, and rebuilt by more raider gangs than we can count, all bidding for power in a toxic city. That is, before the Brotherhood came through.
They called it the Scourge. The Brotherhood of Steel came down on the place with a righteous hammer.
In short, the Scourge was an attack on the PITT's population by the Brotherhood. They wiped out all that stood against them and took the children they deemed healthy enough to join the Brotherhood. Along with them, they took any salvageable technology that they deemed worthwhile, leaving behind the sick and the weak to fend for themselves. The Scourge left a void in the raider gangs of the area in and around the PITT. As the most aggressive and hostile raiders were taken out by the Brotherhood, the weaker and more timid inhabitants were left behind to die. It was during the Scourge that Ishmael Asher was also left behind, as he was involved in an explosion while he was venturing into the steel mill. Though thanks to his power armor, he survived the collapse and went on to use his training from the Brotherhood to take control of the PITT and the inhabitants that were left after the Scourge. Through the training of the inhabitants and with the Brotherhood's tactics backing him, Asher quickly took down those who opposed him and placed himself in charge. The PITT was rebuilt in Asher's image, and in his own words, he wanted to build an empire.
Where others merely survive, we thrive! Our industry is the envy of the Commonwealth. Our safety is the envy of the capital wastes. Our might is the envy of Ronto. And while I have led your efforts, it has been by your own strength that you have earned all the envy of the world. They envy the steel shaped by the workers in our mills. And they envy the strength of our traders and raiders who wield the steel for the PITT!
To start things off, I want to talk about the PITT's community, if you can call it that, its hierarchy and structure, and how it functions. Now, the PITT is built on top of the backs of laborers and slaves imprisoned to do the work that the PITT needs to survive. Without this, the PITT would return to the state in which it was before the Scourge, lawless and with multiple powers fighting for control, leaving the weak to die in the streets. Not to mention those living in the PITT cannot be allowed to procreate due to the TDC, or troglodyte degradation contagion, as the young are far more susceptible to being infected and turning into wild men, or worse, trogs. Asher states at multiple points that the laborers are a necessary part of building the PITT, and once the work is done, they will be free to join the raiders at Uptown. This is a delicate balance that is heavily leaning on one side, though if it weren't for Asher, the PITT would most likely fall into, for lack of a better word, the cesspit that it once was. Now, what Asher is doing is wrong on so many levels, and as history has shown, this power dynamic never works out. I mean, it will for a time, but eventually things will fall apart, just like they do if the Lone Wanderer decides to help Werner and free the PITT. Though the honest and good answer isn't always the case when it comes to the lore in the Fallout universe. With that said, I think that the PITT has the best chance of surviving with Asher in charge. If Werner were left in charge, I think eventually the PITT as a whole would fall back into the anarchy and chaos that it once was. Werner doesn't have the same power that Asher has. People don't fear him, meaning that if Werner were left in charge, it would only be a matter of time before someone would make a play for control, leading the pit straight back into the hole and into the vicious cycle that it was built upon. Not to forget that if Werner is left in charge, nothing changes. He still uses the laborers in the mill to do the work that he deems necessary, meaning you've effectively swapped one dictator for another. Except now the majority of the city has fallen to trogs, and all that remains is downtown. Diving deeper, I think Asher genuinely has the people's best interest at heart. I don't think you go from Brotherhood soldier to ruthless slaver so easily. Listen to him when he says this.
I had to. The city's disease meant we couldn't have children, so recruiting was the only way to grow. And as we grew, the mill needed more workers. And yes, that meant recruiting workers by force. I'm not proud of it, but it's the only way to keep the city supplied and armed.
That doesn't sound like the voice of a dictator or a monster. It sounds like a man that was left to die in a city that itself was left to die. Asher saw what was left in the wake of the Brotherhood and chose to not give up on the city or its people. He, whether you like it or not, has done more good for the city than the Brotherhood ever did. He could have left and reunited with the Lions Brotherhood in DC, but he didn't. He stayed and devised the best plan he could to save the pit. So, if we are going to figure out if the pit has any sort of chance of surviving, then we have to look westwards towards two of the largest factions to come out of the Great War, Caesar's Legion and the NCR. One is extremely similar to the pit in how it operates with forced labor and a facade that the strongest leads the weak. The other has built its back on becoming an industrial powerhouse, which the pit has a likely chance of doing. Now, the PITT Raiders are far more controlled than those we see over the Capital Wasteland, or even those we see in the Mojave Wasteland. These raiders are well armed and organized. Each one of the PITT's raiders were either brought in when other tribes of raiders were absorbed by Asher, or they're laborers that fought in the hole and came out victorious. Both are led by a ruthless leader. Both use forced laborers, strength is prioritized, and finally neither group grows independently, or at least not currently, or well enough to sustain an inflow of new members, so they have to seek out others or obtain new members, meaning the pit will most likely start to engulf smaller raider factions around the wasteland, just like the Legion does with tribals. Now, Caesar did create a fairly large faction that controlled a large portion of the western wasteland, meaning the same tactics can work for the pit. That is, until they meet an opposing group, much like the Legion met the NCR. Who is that opposing group, you might ask? Well, that force for the pit could very well become the Brotherhood led by Arthur Maxon. Asher doesn't seem to be interested in going to war, though. He does seem almost obsessive about building the pit into his own little empire, forged in steel and with a strong fighting force to back him up, much like Caesar himself wanted for the Legion. With the similarities of the PITT Raiders and the Legion out of the way, how are they similar to the NCR? Well, the pit can mass produce its own weapons and ammo, and with vast amounts of scrap metal laying around, they can, and do, and they produce a lot of it, turning this raider group into not only a well-armed society, but also creating a power dynamic for the rest of the region. You want weapons and ammo? Go to the pit. You want steel for airships? Go to the pit. You need steel for armor? Go to the pit. And with the ability to not only build your own armor, much like the scrap power armor that the Raiders build in Fallout 4, I can only imagine that Asher could amass not only a strong market, but a well-equipped fighting force that could possibly stand up against that of even the Brotherhood. Think about this. One of the strongest markets the NCR ever tapped into wasn't traders, it was going to war. The history of the NCR is riddled with war. NCR versus the Brotherhood of Steel, NCR versus the Enclave, NCR versus the Legion, NCR versus the Raider gangs of California. I mean, they have been going to war with everything that stands in their way, and what do they have to show for it? One of the strongest and largest factions and territories in the known wasteland. Think of the strength the Pit could have if they produced their own power armor. I understand that with the conversion in Fallout 4 they would need a lot of power cells, which isn't out of the question. However, as shown in the Nuka World DLC, you can power your own armor with anything, as the Overboss had his suit rigged up to fight the sole survivor in a bumper car arena. So if Asher can produce the power armor and manage to locate or build an alternate power source, he could have a platoon of power-armored raiders at the ready. This wouldn't be impossible after all. They have the steel, and all they would need is schematics for power armor. And with the city around them in the state that it's in, I'm sure buried inside the rubble is exactly what Asher needs. Not to mention that finding things wouldn't be all that hard for the faction that has such a far-reaching grasp. Like I mentioned earlier, while in the pit, the player can talk to a fellow laborer named Brand that asks where you're from, mentioning a place called Ronto. Ronto, I can only assume, is shorthand for Toronto, meaning that the pit has or had people from that region, showing just how far the PITT Raiders have traveled. If we take the roughly 317 miles or 510 kilometers and then double it from center, we get a rough idea of the pit's area of contact or influence. That means they could have a reach that not only reaches Toronto but also Columbus, Detroit, Cleveland, and whatever else falls in between, meaning Asher has no shortage for fellow raiders to bring into the fold, and not to mention the amount of supplies they could have, from raw building materials all the way to heavy machinery. This could lead the pit out of the Dark Ages and into a new era. Currently, what the pit is doing isn't sustainable. However, if Asher was to take in and envelop other raider factions within the area of influence, much like Caesar does with the Legion, then he very well could be building out an empire that he claims the pit to be. The one thing that the pit has over the Legion, the one thing that solidifies Asher's empire as long-lasting, is their foundry and steel mills. Unlike the Legion, the pit isn't limited in weapons and ammunition and can actually equip its warriors with proper protection. Armor, ammo, weapons, you name it, and the pit can provide it in abundance, meaning Asher could very well have a new Eastern Legion on his hands. Asher has almost everything he needs to build his empire, and between the miles of scrap metal and steel, he has found a treasure trove that the Brotherhood missed. Asher saw what the pit could offer, and he took it for his own. Now this is all only possible if Maxon hasn't already taken out the PITT Raiders. And I don't think he has. At least not yet. Now, in the time between Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, Maxon not only grew up, but also set the chapter on a new path. Over the course of 10 years, he mobilized the BOS, brought the outcasts back into the fold, rebuilt Liberty Prime, mostly, but also built a giant flying warship along with stabilizing the region, specifically the DC region. I'd say Maxon has been a little busy, not to mention the sheer number of soldiers he has amassed. Not only does he have enough soldiers to send out multiple recon parties to the same location, but he also has a full-scale invasion force ready to go. That right there is one of the biggest signs that perhaps a war with the pit is yet to come. Because if it had already happened, I very much doubt Maxon would have so many able bodies to just send out into the wasteland like he does. So perhaps the pit is Maxon's next effort. Perhaps it will be the next great war the wasteland will ever see. What do you think? Could the pit and Asher become the new Eastern faction that rivals Maxon's control of the region? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see you in the wasteland.
Until we can reproduce a treatment from Marie, they'll have to keep working. Otherwise, this city falls apart. But once we do have a cure, things will be different. We'll be able to grow naturally.